So your quiz on Wednesday is going to be, I guess the majority of it's going to focus on Protists. There's a bunch of questions, labeling Protists, things like that. We'll talk more about it tomorrow, but let's just quickly review the 3 Protists that we looked at in class, the 3 main examples that we've been talking about for the last week or so. So Ameba, Paramecium, Euglena. You got to know them apart, got to know some of the details about each of them. So Ameba. What's the shape of an amoeba? Emily?
It looks like a circle with arms.
Yeah, it's sort of like a, I don't know, a blob shape, just a random shape. Its shape changes constantly. It has a flexible membrane. Doesn't have any specific shape. How about Paramecium? What would you how would you describe that shape? A foot, a shoe, a slipper. And the Euglena,
Looks like a
it's kind of like a cucumber, a torpedo,
jalapeno.
a pickle.
It's a jalapeno.
All right, tell me, how does the amoeba move?
Like this. It oozes.
It blobs around.
What?
It uses the pseudopods.
It uses pseudopods to sort of blob along. It oozes forward. How's the paramecium move? Raise your hand, please. Paramecium. Lindsay? Those tiny little hairs, we call them cilia. How about the Euglena? Natalia? Yes, the flagellum, the whip-like tail. How do they ingest food? The amoeba. Emily?
Its arms.
Yeah, those pseudopods just blob around it and surround it. How about the paramecium, Casey? By the oral groove, the mouth-like thing that takes food into it. And then the Euglena, it doesn't need to ingest food if light is available. It can go through photosynthesis to make its own food. If light is not, materials can diffuse into it. Nutrients can diffuse into it and engulf it. And for reproduction, they all reproduce through the process of binary fission. What form of reproduction is that? Asexual. It's just them making a copy of their DNA and then splitting in two. So that's asexual reproduction. All right, so let's talk a bit about fungi. So in our kingdom, we've talked about bacteria, we've talked about archaea, right? We talked about protists. Now we'll talk about fungi, then we'll move on to plants and eventually animals. So fungi, and I don't remember what domain they belong in. There's only 3 domains. Right?
Oh, it's just in my head. Right.
You can.
Lindsay? No, they're not bacteria. Okay? Eukarya. They're in the domain eukarya with all the other eukaryotes. They're their own kingdom, fungi. So you guys listed their characteristics for me in our question of the day. Some are multicellular, some are unicellular. Most are multicellular.
We don't have that.
Yeah, write that in there. You just write multicellular. Yeah, you're going to have to write all of them. How about nucleus? What's the word we'll use for them? The nucleus? Eukaryote. They're eukaryotic. They're eukaryotes. They have a nucleus that encloses their DNA. their nutrition, how they get energy. Emily?
Don't they eat like stuff from like logs and stuff like that?
Yeah, they're heterotrophs. They have to digest material and consume it. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but they have a special type of digestion. It's called extracellular. It happens outside of their cells. A couple other factors. They do have a cell wall. So like we talked about, plants have a cell wall, bacteria have a cell wall, fungi have a cell wall. And it's made of a material called chitin. It's a special type of protein that makes their cell wall unique. And fungi reproduce several ways. They can reproduce sexually, and they produce spores, which spread and then grow into new fungi. They can go through the process of budding, in which, as we talked about, a new organism, sort of just a new fungi starts to grow from part of the original. And most of these fungi are decomposers. They are breaking down dead material. Organic matter that's found in the soil. So examples of fungi are mushrooms, but also things like mold that might grow on an old piece of bread. Mold and mildew that grow in sort of damp areas. Yeast that we use for baking and fermenting things, that's a fungus.
Okay, go to the bathroom.
Should I start curious with that? These are yeast. This is a microscope image of yeast, these tiny little circular things. And so, you don't have some of these slides that we're going to be going through, so just look and pay attention. So this is a mushroom, and I'm sure you've seen mushrooms growing in your yard or the forest and stuff. Okay, the mushroom is made of several parts. Okay, you have the cap of the mushroom, sort of the most obvious part, and they sometimes are brightly colored. Sometimes they have speckles on them or bumps. There's lots of different types of mushrooms around. The underside of the mushroom cap has gills. Okay, and the gills are where the spores are produced. Sometimes people are hunting for mushrooms that are edible and try to identify them. And one of the ways you identify a mushroom is through its gill prints. I have my mushroom book here. Must be at home. I have a field guide to mushrooms. But anyway, if you take a mushroom cap and you put it on a white sheet of paper overnight and then pick it up the next day, what you'll find on the paper is a spore print. The spores from that mushroom will settle onto that white sheet of paper, and by looking at the color of those spores, it's one of the things we use to identify a mushroom. And those spores are the reproductive cells. The sort of stalk is the sort of stem that grows out of the ground, and then the things that you might think are roots, they're called hyphae. So the cap protects the spores, which are produced in the gills. Spores are the reproductive cells. And these hyphae, this is what actually breaks down food and absorbs nutrients from the soil, from what's being broken down. Because what happens in these hyphae, they secrete enzymes. Just like in our digestive system, we have enzymes to break down different foods. Well, the hyphae of these mushrooms secrete enzymes, but it happens outside, and they break down organic matter in the soil, and then they absorb that organic matter. So the digestion is happening outside of the cells, and then they get reabsorbed. In my front yard at our house, we used to have these big maple trees in the front of our house, and we had to take one of them down. And we had it cut down and they took away the wood and they ground the stump up, then filled it in, planted grass. But every single spring now, right where that tree used to be, when conditions are sort of rainy and wet, all of a sudden hundreds of mushrooms start growing for a few weeks every spring. Why do they grow there every single year? Lindsay? Yeah, you're exactly right, because that's where the tree once was, and they're like forming this ring right around where the tree was, the exact spot. What they're doing is in the ground, they grind out like most of the stump, but there's still all the roots of the tree. Lots of them are still there in the ground, and they're no longer alive because the tree's gone, and they're breaking down and they're dead. And what happens is these fungi grow from spores in the soil, and these hyphae are breaking down those roots slowly over time. And so every spring they grow, they're breaking down those roots, and that's why they grow there. You might be walking through a forest, see like a rotted log, you might see mushrooms growing out of it, or those artist fungus that you see on the side of trees. They are also fungi. They're just breaking down the organic matter in those trees and using it as their nutrients. That's what they eat. So they're decomposers, okay? They break down organic material, dead organisms, rotting wood, and so forth. Also, there are some fungi that are parasites. Things like athlete's foot is a fungal disease, or ringworm is a fungal disease that grows on people's skin, okay, and causes it to be irritated, causes the skin to die, causes it to be red, painful, and it can spread from person to person. Why is it called athlete's foot? You can get it, in like a locker room if you're walking around with no shoes on and somebody had athlete's foot. That fungus can get in onto the ground in those wet, damp areas, and then could spread from person to person in that way. Okay. Some fungi even infect insects, and there's a neat video I'll show you in a minute. And there are some beneficial uses of fungi as well. Okay. In fact, antibiotics were first discovered in fungi. Okay? Penicillin came from a type of fungus that what people noticed is when they're growing bacteria in petri dishes, around where you had a fungus spore, no bacteria would grow around it. And the reason is because that fungus is producing a special chemical that kills the bacteria. And so they extracted that, identified what the compound was, and that's where we got our first antibiotics, from these fungus. Some things that we eat are produced by fungus. Okay? Blue cheese. You guys like blue cheese?
No.
Okay? The blue stuff are fungi. Okay, the blue part of blue cheese, it's caused by a fungus, Penicillum roqueforti. Okay? And that gives those cheeses a certain distinctive flavor. Okay? Yeah, you eat fungus. Well, you eat mushrooms, right? That's fungus. You eat yeast. Yeast is used to make bread, beer, wine. Okay? Some yeast that used to make bread digests sugars in the dough, consumes it, uses it for energy, and produces carbon dioxide, which causes the bread to rise. Some yeast do the same thing in sugary water or molten water, and that's what forms beer or wine, what makes it alcoholic and what makes it carbonated as well. Okay? So those are our notes about fungi. Little fungus joke there. Mr. Akiri likes that one. Okay? And again, this is what do you think was here? Yeah, those are probably areas where there were trees once. There's still the roots in the ground. And probably each year this ring gets a little bit wider because they're consuming the interior parts of those remaining roots in the ground and move outward to affect some of those. This is ringworm. That's not from my house. That's ringworm. It's just a skin infection that causes by a fungus.
How does it like make a perfect circle?
It just does. That's the way it grows. All right. So I want to show you a couple of videos here. Stop this.